There is something deeply unsettling about the final recording connected to Nolan Xavier Wells, because it does not sound like the beginning of a murder investigation. It sounds like a routine call for help. A teenager is speaking to a private towing company from a boat near Horn Island, Mississippi, explaining that a pump has stopped working and that the vessel is taking on water. The dispatcher asks questions. The caller tries to explain where they are. In the background, other voices move in and out of the recording. And beneath the obvious conversation, there are sounds that some listeners now believe may contain something far more significant. Some people say they hear the name Nolan. Others believe they hear a question that sounds like, "Is he dead?" Online, the interpretation has become even more dramatic, with some listeners claiming to hear additional phrases. But there is an important distinction between what a recording contains and what people think they hear inside it. The audio has not publicly been authenticated as containing those words, and forensic audio experts have warned that enhancement can sometimes create artifacts or reinforce what the listener already expects to hear. That distinction matters because Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old when he disappeared during a 4th of July trip to Horn Island, and 2 days later, his body was recovered from the water near the island. His independent autopsy later listed both the cause and manner of death as undetermined. It found no fractures or deep tissue injuries, but noted an unexplained area of red discoloration at the back of his skull. The pathologist also said he could not rule out the possibility that non-accidental factors contributed to or caused Nolan's death. Those findings did not prove homicide. They did something more complicated. They left the door open. And now, weeks after that 4th of July celebration, the question surrounding Nolan's final hours has become less about one theory and more about whether the timeline itself can be reconstructed accurately enough to determine what happened. Horn Island is not an ordinary vacation destination. It is a long, undeveloped barrier island along Mississippi's Gulf Coast, separated from the mainland by open water and accessible primarily by boat. There are no normal city streets, no neighborhood houses, and no easy way for someone stranded there to simply walk home. On July 4th, 2026, the island became a gathering place for people celebrating the holiday on the Gulf. Nolan went there with friends. The morning began like a holiday. The boat left a private dock at approximately 9:56 a.m., according to vessel tracking information, and reached Horn Island around 11:14. Photographs from the day show Nolan with friends on the boat, appearing relaxed and happy. Nothing in those images tells us that the day would end with his family searching for him. But sometime during the afternoon, the atmosphere changed. According to accounts that have emerged publicly, Nolan was last seen by some members of the group around 3 p.m. There are conflicting descriptions of what he intended to do afterward. One account says he decided to remain on the island and return later with another group. Another version has suggested he intended to return with the people he had arrived with. A young woman has also been mentioned in accounts of the afternoon, with differing descriptions of what Nolan told her and what he intended to do next. That difference may sound small. It is not. Because if Nolan voluntarily chose to remain behind, the central question becomes why an 18-year-old would do so without the phone and other belongings that would ordinarily help him arrange his return. But if he did not choose to remain behind, then the circumstances surrounding the group's departure become much more important. At approximately 4:31 p.m., the boat left Horn Island. The explanation given publicly was that the vessel developed mechanical trouble and began taking on water. The group called for assistance. The distress call that followed has now become one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the case. In the recording released by the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, a young caller tells the towing operator that a pump is not working and that the boat is sinking. He explains that they are in approximately 31 feet of water and need the boat to be towed. The operator asks about the people aboard, and the caller indicates that there are several others with him. The recording itself is real. The call itself is documented. What remains disputed is what can be heard around the edges of that conversation. The original recording is difficult to understand. That is precisely why an audio engineer, Janetta Brantley, later processed the recording using traditional audio techniques including noise reduction, equalization, compression, and frequency isolation. She said she deliberately avoided artificial intelligence voice separation because aggressive processing can introduce sounds that were not actually present in the original. After the enhanced version circulated, listeners began slowing it down and repeatedly listening to the background. And that is where the case entered a new phase. Some listeners believe a voice says, "Nolan." Others believe they hear something resembling, "Is he dead?" Those interpretations have spread rapidly across social media, but they remain interpretations, not established evidence. Even professionals who acknowledge that the background may deserve forensic examination caution against treating internet-enhanced audio as proof of what was said. A proper forensic examination would require the original, uncompressed recording, preservation of the chain of custody, and careful analysis designed to determine whether a perceived word is actually supported by the acoustic evidence. That leaves us with an unusual situation. The recording is genuine. The voices are genuine. But the words people believe they hear have not been publicly established as fact. And yet the timing of the call makes the audio important regardless. Because this call occurred during the very period when Nolan's whereabouts became uncertain. The boat was experiencing trouble around 4 p.m. The group eventually returned to the mainland. Nolan did not return with them. GPS information provides another piece of the timeline. The vessel left Horn Island in the afternoon and later traveled toward Fort Bayou before returning to the dock. Publicly released tracking information places the boat's movements within a sequence that can be compared against witness statements and the distress call. That is where investigators, attorneys, and independent researchers face the same problem. A timeline can tell you where a boat was. It cannot automatically tell you what happened to a person. The next major issue is Nolan's phone. According to the family, the phone was later recovered from people connected to the trip. Questions have also been raised about the lack of expected July 4th content on the device and whether data may have been deleted. The family hired an expert to examine the phone and sought an independent autopsy. But as of the latest reporting, the phone has still not undergone the full forensic analysis the family wants, amid disagreement over how the examination should be conducted. That means one potentially important digital timeline remains unresolved. Phones can contain timestamps. They can contain photographs, messages, location information, application activity, and other traces of what happened during a particular period. But until a qualified forensic examination is completed, speculation about deleted information remains speculation. Then there is the video. Attorney Ben Crump has circulated a video that he says appears to show an argument that occurred around the island. In the recording, a voice appears to say words resembling, "Give me my freaking phone. What are you freaking doing?" Crump has suggested that the footage could be relevant to the investigation, and has also said he received tips about a confrontation involving Nolan. But the people who were there dispute that interpretation. Traciston Shepard, who was on the island, has said the voice in the video is his, not Nolan's. He has also said Nolan does not appear in the confrontation itself, and that the argument involved Shepard and another man over Shepard's girlfriend. His account, according to reporting, has been corroborated by his girlfriend and his uncle, who were also present. Another friend, Javon Williams, has said he did not believe the voice was Nolan's, although he could not determine whether the figure shown was Nolan. Sheriff Ledbetter has said the video is being considered as part of the investigation. So again, the same problem appears. There is evidence. There is interpretation. And there is a gap between the two. The photograph involving Nolan and a group of people in a swimming pool has produced another disagreement. Crump has suggested the image might be relevant to the timeline, including a theory that Nolan could have returned to the mainland early on July 5th and died afterward, with his body eventually ending up in the ocean. But Judge Ashley Cole, whose son Warren was among those connected to the trip, has said the photograph was actually taken on June 27th, more than a week before the 4th of July. That means the photograph cannot establish what happened on July 4th unless its date can be independently verified and shown to be different from what has been claimed. This is why chronology matters so much in a case like this. A photograph without a reliable timestamp can be misleading. A video without established identities can be misleading. An audio recording without forensic interpretation can be misleading. And a theory built on several uncertain pieces can become more convincing online than it is in an evidence room. But the questions surrounding Nolan's death did not disappear when the body was recovered. They intensified. Nolan's body was found on July 6th near Horn Island, 2 days after the 4th of July trip. The initial investigation considered drowning, and authorities did not publicly announce evidence establishing foul play. But the family remained unconvinced that the circumstances had been fully explained. Then came the independent autopsy. Dr. Roger A. Mitchell, Jr., a forensic pathologist and president of Howard University Hospital, examined Nolan's remains in Washington, D.C. His report did not identify a fracture or deep tissue injury, but it described red discoloration at the back of Nolan's skull, and Mitchell could not determine what caused it. More importantly, he could not determine the cause or manner of death. The limitations of that examination were significant. Nolan's body had already undergone a previous autopsy, and decomposition had progressed. Parts of the neck structures and lungs had already been removed during the earlier examination. As a result, Mitchell could not independently evaluate whether Nolan had suffered certain neck injuries or whether water had entered his lungs. That does not mean Nolan was murdered. It means the independent pathologist could not exclude non-accidental factors based on the material available to him. That distinction is crucial. An undetermined autopsy is not a declaration of homicide. It is a statement that the available evidence does not allow the pathologist to confidently determine how the death occurred. And that uncertainty is precisely what has allowed the competing narratives to survive. One possibility is that Nolan drowned after remaining on the island, whether through accident, exhaustion, currents, or another environmental circumstance. Another possibility raised by people questioning the case is that something happened before he entered the water. A third possibility is that the timeline has been misunderstood, and Nolan's movements after the group departed were different from what has been publicly described. At this stage, none of those possibilities has been established as the truth. And that is why the boat audio matters. Not because a few seconds of muffled background sound can solve a death investigation, but because if the original recording can be professionally analyzed and the voices reliably identified, it could potentially establish what people aboard the vessel were discussing at a critical moment. If someone actually said Nolan's name, investigators would still need to determine why. If someone actually asked whether Nolan was dead, investigators would need to determine what prompted the question. And if the words are ultimately found to be something completely different, that would matter too. Evidence does not only confirm theories. Sometimes it destroys them. There is another layer to the case that cannot be ignored: the racial context. Nolan was black. The group he traveled with included several white friends, and his disappearance occurred in Mississippi, a state whose history of racial violence and segregation continues to shape public perceptions of suspicious deaths. Black activists, social media users, and internet investigators have raised concerns about whether race played a role in what happened or in the way the investigation was handled. But the public response has also generated misinformation and accusations against people who have not been charged with Nolan's death. That distinction became increasingly important as threats began reaching people connected to the case. Friends of Nolan's have reported harassment. Some people connected to the trip deleted social media accounts. Threats were serious enough to trigger federal attention, and multiple people were later charged in connection with alleged threatening communications involving individuals tied to the investigation. The danger here is obvious. A demand for answers is legitimate. A rush to identify a murderer without evidence is something entirely different. Nolan's family has pursued its own investigation, including legal efforts to preserve evidence and obtain digital and forensic information. They have received widespread support, including financial and public support from prominent figures. Civil rights attorney Ben Crump has continued to press for answers, while others, including law enforcement officials and analysts, have urged people not to reach conclusions before the investigation is complete. The competing reactions have created two narratives. One says the unanswered questions are themselves evidence that something is wrong. The other says unanswered questions are normal in an ongoing investigation and should not be transformed into accusations. The truth may eventually be found somewhere between those positions. Because beneath all the arguments over race, social media, attorneys, enhanced audio, and competing theories is a much simpler question. What happened to Nolan Wells between the last confirmed moments anyone can place him on Horn Island and the moment his body was recovered? That is the missing bridge. And right now, the bridge is incomplete. The CTO recording gives investigators a real time-stamped event in the afternoon. The vessel's GPS data provides another, witness statements provide additional pieces. The video may contain information if the identities and date can be conclusively established. The phone may contain digital evidence once a proper forensic examination occurs. The autopsy tells us what could and could not be determined from Nolan's remains. But none of these pieces individually answers the central question. The most important task now is not to make the evidence fit a theory. It is to make the theory fit the evidence. If the audio is authentic and the background voices can be scientifically established, it may become an important part of that reconstruction. If the voices cannot be reliably understood, then the responsible conclusion is simply that they remain ambiguous. If the phone reveals deleted or altered data, investigators will need to establish when, how, and by whom that happened. If the video proves to show Nolan, then the confrontation must be placed precisely within the day's timeline. If it does not, another popular theory collapses. And if additional forensic evidence eventually establishes how Nolan entered the water, then many of today's unanswered questions may finally have an explanation. For now, however, the case remains suspended between what is known and what is suspected. We know Nolan went to Horn Island on July 4th. We know he did not return to the mainland with the group. We know a distress call was made from the boat around the time it experienced mechanical trouble. We know Nolan was reported missing. We know his body was recovered 2 days later. We know an independent pathologist could not determine the cause or manner of death and could not rule out non-accidental factors. And we know that some of the most heavily discussed pieces of evidence, the enhanced audio, the confrontation video, and the disputed photograph, remain subject to interpretation or conflicting accounts. As of now, no publicly established evidence proves that Nolan Wells was murdered. But neither has the complete story of his final hours been established to everyone's satisfaction. And perhaps that is what makes the audio so haunting. It is not necessarily what the recording proves. It is what it might contain. Somewhere beneath the dispatcher asking questions, beneath the noise of the boat and the voices of the people aboard, there may be a fragment of the truth about what happened that afternoon. Or there may simply be sounds that the human mind desperately wants to turn into words. The difference can only be determined by evidence, not expectation. And until the original audio, the phone, the remaining forensic evidence, the witness accounts, and the full official investigation can be brought together, Nolan Wells' final hours remain a story with missing pieces. The Gulf does not preserve timelines. Water moves. Boats move. People move. Memories change. And voices recorded in the background can become louder on the internet than they ever were in real life. But somewhere in that confusion is a factual sequence of events. Nolan was there. Then he was gone. 2 days later, he was dead. The question now is not simply whether the story sounds suspicious. It is whether the evidence can tell us exactly why.